Imagine this. A crowded city square under the burning sun. An iron cauldron bubbles with oil, the flames licking higher with every passing moment. A Roman general, once celebrated as a hero, now blinded, broken and trembling, is dragged before thousands of onlookers. Chains rattle as he's hoisted above the seething pot, his flesh already blistered from earlier torments. The crowd holds its breath, and then he screams, the kind of scream that doesn't just pierce the air but pierces the soul. Inch by inch, he is lowered into the boiling oil, and with every hiss of burning flesh, history is etched with one of its darkest punishments. But how did one of Rome's greatest generals, Marcus Atilius Regulus, end up suffering a fate so unimaginable that even his enemies recoiled in horror? Tonight, we peel back the layers of history, betrayal, and cruelty to uncover a story so haunting it still shakes us thousands of years later. To understand how this nightmare began, we have to go back decades before the cauldron was ever lit. Back to a time when Rome and Carthage were locked in a battle not just for territory, but for supremacy of the known world. It was the mid-3rd century BC, during the First Punic War. On one side, Rome, the ambitious rising republic of Italy, hungry for expansion. On the other, Carthage, a wealthy seafaring empire with trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean. The stakes were enormous. Whoever won would control the sea, the islands, and the riches of a growing ancient world. Marcus Atilius Regulus was no ordinary commander. Born into a respected Roman family, he rose through the ranks with discipline, courage, and an unwavering sense of honor. To the Romans, Regulus embodied everything their republic stood for: loyalty, sacrifice, and an almost fanatical devotion to duty. His victories in battle cemented his reputation, and when Rome decided to strike at the heart of Carthage, it was Regulus they sent across the sea. Imagine the sight: Roman legions marching into North Africa, a land of strange gods and foreign languages, their armor gleaming under the African sun. For the first time in history, Rome was invading Carthage on its own soil. At first, the campaign went brilliantly. Regulus's legions smashed through Carthaginian defenses and advanced toward the city itself. Rome seemed on the brink of total victory. But victory bred arrogance. Regulus, confident in his successes, offered Carthage peace terms so humiliating they were little more than demands for surrender. The Carthaginians were outraged. Rather than submit, they vowed revenge, and they found their instrument in a mercenary from Greece, a Spartan named Xanthippus. Trained in the art of disciplined warfare, Xanthippus drilled Carthage's battered forces into shape. When the two armies finally clashed at the Battle of Tunis, the result was a disaster for Rome. Thousands of soldiers were slaughtered. Regulus himself, the great Roman consul, was captured alive. Here, the story begins to turn from triumph to tragedy. The once proud general was dragged in chains through the streets of Carthage, jeered at by crowds who saw in him the embodiment of Roman arrogance. For years he languished in a Carthaginian prison, his fate uncertain. Rome, meanwhile, assumed he was dead. His name became a whisper, a legend of a hero lost in foreign lands. But Regulus was not dead, and his destiny was not to end quietly in a dungeon. Years later, weary from endless battles, the Carthaginians devised a plan. They would send Regulus back to Rome not as a freed man, but as a pawn. He was to negotiate peace or arrange a prisoner exchange, but only under one condition. He must swear an oath to return to Carthage afterward. Imagine that moment. Regulus, after years in captivity, given a chance to see his homeland again, to walk the streets of Rome, to embrace his family. All he had to do was give his word that he would return. For most men, the choice would have been simple. Freedom is freedom, and oaths can be bent or broken. But Regulus was not most men. Bound by the Roman ideal of fides, faith, loyalty, honor, he swore the oath. And with that, he set sail for Rome, knowing full well he was sailing toward death. When he arrived, the city erupted in astonishment. A man thought dead was suddenly among them, walking through the forum like a figure risen from myth. His family wept with joy. His fellow senators embraced him. And then came the moment Carthage had planned. Regulus stood before the Senate, expected to urge his countrymen to accept peace. His captors assumed he would plead for Rome to surrender, if only to save himself and his fellow prisoners from suffering. But in one of the most extraordinary acts of defiance in history, Regulus did the unthinkable. He told Rome to fight on. He warned them not to trust Carthage, not to bow to dishonorable terms. He urged his people to reject peace, even though he knew that by doing so, he was condemning himself. Imagine his family in that chamber, his wife, his children clinging to him, begging him to stay. He could have remained in Rome. He could have broken his oath. No one would have blamed him, but Marcus Atilius Regulus pulled away gently, declaring that his honor demanded his return. His word, once given, could not be broken. He left behind a weeping household, boarded a ship, and sailed back across the sea. Every wave carried him closer to torment. The Carthaginians, upon hearing his words, were enraged. They had expected compliance, maybe even gratitude. Instead, Regulus had defied them, insulted them, and turned their plan into humiliation. Now, he was entirely at their mercy. And mercy, as we'll soon see, was something they had none of. What awaited him would not be a swift execution. No, the Carthaginians decided that this Roman would die slowly, in agony, his body and spirit broken piece by piece. But here's the question we must ask. Was Regulus a fool for clinging to honor in the face of certain death? Or was he the ultimate Roman, a martyr to principle whose sacrifice would echo across centuries? Before we rush to answer, we must follow him into the dungeon where his torment began. The iron gates slammed shut behind him, echoing through the stone corridors of Carthage's prison. Marcus Atilius Regulus, once a commander of thousands, was now reduced to a single body in chains, locked in a dark, airless cell. The Carthaginians had no intention of granting him the dignity of a warrior's death. They wanted something far more cruel. They wanted to break him, not with a sword, not with poison, but with time, torment, and humiliation. For days he was left in silence. No bed, no fire, no comfort. The cold stone floor became his only companion. The air reeked of mildew and decay, and the faint scurrying of rats was the only sound that kept him company. Food was scarce, water scarcer. He was deliberately weakened, his soldier's body stripped of its strength. Carthage wasn't rushing. They were preparing him, softening the flesh before the real horrors began. And in this limbo, Regulus had time to think, to wonder whether his choice to honor the oath had been noble or fatal. But the Carthaginians were masters of psychological torment. They didn't start with whips or blades. They started with his mind. Guards kept him awake night after night, jabbing him with spears if he dared to close his eyes. They forced him to march in circles until his legs trembled. They taunted him with whispers that Rome had forgotten him, that his Senate had moved on, that his family would never see him again. Sleep, the simplest human need, was denied. And with every passing hour, the proud Roman's mind began to blur. Reality and nightmare melted together. When exhaustion brought him to the edge of collapse, they escalated. One day, Regulus was dragged into the blinding North African sun. His pupils, starved of light for weeks, burned with searing pain. A crowd gathered, murmuring, curious. Then came one of the cruelest acts of ingenuity. A Carthaginian executioner stepped forward with a knife. In one swift motion, he sliced off Regulus's eyelid. The folds of skin that shield the eyes gone. Blood streamed down his cheeks as he realized the full horror. He would never again close his eyes, never blink, never find relief from the merciless glare of the sun. Imagine it, the relentless desert light burning into raw eyes. Every grain of dust scraping like shards of glass across exposed nerves. Witnesses recorded that he screamed, a raw animal sound that made even hardened soldiers flinch. And still, it wasn't enough. The Carthaginians weren't satisfied with pain. They wanted degradation. They locked him in a wooden cage, barely the size of his body. But this was no ordinary cage. The inside was lined with sharp iron spikes. Regulus was forced to stand upright, his arms twisted in chains. At first he held his body rigid to avoid the spikes, but hours passed, his legs quivered, and exhaustion overcame him. His body slumped and the spikes dug into his flesh. He jerked back upright, but the other side of the cage pierced him again. No movement was safe. Every shift of his weight drove fresh wounds into his body. The torture wasn't a moment. It was endless, designed to stretch his suffering across hours, then days. And yet even here, Regulus didn't break. That was what tormented his captors most. He groaned, he bled, he writhed in agony, but he didn't beg for mercy. He didn't curse Rome for abandoning him. He endured, clinging to the last fragments of Roman dignity. And in that endurance, something extraordinary happened. Whispers began to spread through Carthage. Some citizens admired his iron will. Others were unsettled, even ashamed. watching their leaders torment a man who refused to yield. In trying to humiliate him, the Carthaginians had turned him into something else, a symbol, but symbols don't live forever. His body weakened, his flesh became a map of wounds, his vision a haze of pain. And still, Carthage wanted more. They weren't content with silent suffering in the dark. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted Rome to feel this pain, to hear of it, to tremble at the thought of defying them. And so the order was given. Regulus's torment would no longer be hidden in the dungeon. It would be brought into the open, before the eyes of thousands. The crowd would become witness, and his death would be turned into theater. This is where his story shifts again, from private torture to public execution, from silent endurance to screams that would echo through the streets of Carthage. But before that final cauldron of oil was prepared, the Carthaginians made sure Regulus was paraded through the city in chains. The people, young and old, lined the streets, some jeering, others uneasy as the once mighty consul stumbled past, skin flayed by spikes, eyes burning raw under the sun. And in that moment, it wasn't just Rome's honor being tested, it was humanity itself. And here's where we must pause. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what it meant. Was Carthage trying to terrify Rome, or were they trying to terrify their own people into obedience, showing them that no one, not even a Roman general, could defy Carthage and survive? The answer lies in the spectacle that was about to unfold. The boiling oil, the screaming flesh, the silence that would follow when even a city of enemies realized they had gone too far. But before the fire was lit, before the oil began to bubble, Carthage gave the world one last lesson in cruelty. And Regulus, bleeding, blinded but unbroken, walked toward it without flinching. The city of Carthage awoke with a buzz of anticipation. Word had spread like wildfire. The Roman general who had defied their mercy, who had spat in the face of peace, was to be executed. Not swiftly, not quietly, but in a manner so terrible that it would leave an imprint on every soul who witnessed it. Markets emptied, workshops closed, and people crowded the streets to catch a glimpse of the condemned man's final hours. Carthage was turning Regulus's death into theater, and the entire city had been invited. Dragged from his cage, Regulus stumbled into the blinding daylight. The crowd gasped at the sight. His once proud frame was skeletal, his flesh pierced with countless wounds from the spikes, his eyes raw and red, unable to close, his face a map of torment carved by sleepless nights and ceaseless pain. Chains rattled with each faltering step. He was no longer the polished Roman consul, but a living corpse kept alive for spectacle. And yet, his head was held high. Even broken, Regulus radiated a defiance that unsettled the crowd. Some jeered and shouted insults. Others whispered uneasily, wondering if tormenting such a man would curse them all. The Carthaginian executioners had prepared a monstrous stage in the city square. At its center stood a massive iron cauldron, blackened from the heat of the roaring fire beneath. Already the oil inside bubbled and hissed, spitting droplets of burning liquid into the air. The smell was acrid, heavy like a storm of smoke and grease rolling across the plaza. Children clung to their mothers, merchants whispered, and soldiers watched silently, their armor gleaming in the cruel sun. This was no ordinary execution. It was vengeance, ritualized cruelty designed to echo through history. As Regulus was dragged onto the platform, silence fell. Even the jeering stopped. All eyes locked on the trembling figure. Some in the front rows smiled grimly, eager to see Rome's arrogance punished. Others turned pale, disturbed by the monstrous cauldron and the smell of burning oil. The executioners bound Regulus in chains, suspending him above the vat. He could feel the waves of heat rising toward his blistered skin. He knew what was coming. But not once did he beg, not once did he ask for mercy. His silence was louder than any words. Then came the signal. With deliberate cruelty, the chains were lowered inch by inch. The first contact was his feet. The moment they touched the boiling oil, the square erupted with a hiss, followed by a scream so piercing it seemed to rip through the sky itself. For the first time, the unyielding Roman could not hold back. His body convulsed violently, the smell of searing flesh rising into the air as the oil clung to his skin, cooking it instantly. The sound of his agony echoed across the square, a raw, guttural cry that silenced even the cruelest of spectators. The executioners continued their work slowly. His legs sank deeper into the oil, blisters erupting and bursting as the heat consumed him. Bits of flesh bubbled away, rising to the surface in grotesque patterns. Regulus's screams turned into something beyond human, an unearthly wail of pain, his body jerking against the chains in reflex. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some covered their mouths, unable to watch. Others looked on with grim satisfaction, whispering that Rome was finally being humbled. A few, perhaps, felt shame, seeing in Regulus not just an enemy but a man enduring suffering no human should face. When the oil reached his waist, the air grew thick with the smell of burning flesh. Witnesses gagged, some turning away, others trembling with horror. Regulus's once powerful frame now writhed like a rag doll, convulsing with every inch he was lowered. His voice cracked, his screams fading into broken gasps. Yet even in this state he never pleaded for release. That perhaps was his last act of defiance, to suffer in silence when silence was all he had left to control. The Carthaginians pressed on. Inch by inch the chains lowered him further. His torso disappeared beneath the bubbling surface, his skin blackening, peeling, his nerves overwhelmed. The sound of the boiling cauldron grew louder than his cries. The audience, once so eager, now stood in uneasy silence. Even those who had demanded this vengeance began to question if they had gone too far. It was no longer justice. It was cruelty so monstrous it left scars not only on the victim, but on those who watched. At last, the oil rose to his neck. Regulus's head tilted back in a final spasm, his mouth open in a soundless cry. For a moment his eyes, raw, lidless, staring straight into the sun, seemed to burn with something more than pain. Perhaps it was defiance. Perhaps it was resignation. Perhaps it was simply the last flicker of humanity clinging to life. Then mercifully the chains lowered him fully, and his head slipped beneath the surface. The oil gurgled, bubbled, hissed, and then stilled. Silence. The executioners pulled the chains back, raising what remained of him above the cauldron. His body was no longer recognizable. Blackened, blistered, dripping with oil, it hung limply in the air. For a moment no one spoke. The city that had demanded his death now stood frozen in shock. Some stared in awe, others in horror, all knowing they had witnessed something far beyond punishment. They had seen a man reduced to ash and agony, a Roman consul transformed into a grotesque legend. That silence was heavy, suffocating. Eventually, whispers rose. Some muttered that Carthage had taken revenge. Others murmured that Rome would never forgive, that Regulus's death would ignite their fury rather than extinguish it. Mothers pulled their children away, shielding their eyes. And in that uneasy quiet, the Carthaginians realized something chilling. They had not just killed a man, they had created a martyr. News of Regulus's death would travel fast. Rome would hear of it, not as a warning, but as a story of sacrifice and honor. And while Carthage believed they had broken their enemy, they had in fact given Rome something far more dangerous than a general. They had given them a symbol. When the chains finally lifted Regulus's ruined body from the cauldron, dripping with oil and charred flesh, Carthage believed the message was clear. They had silenced a Roman general, reduced him to ash before a trembling crowd, and proved to the world what fate awaited those who defied them. But messages are rarely received the way they are intended, and when news of that grotesque spectacle reached Rome, it sparked not fear, but fury. Travelers, merchants, and surviving prisoners carried the tale back across the sea. At first, many Romans refused to believe it. That a consul of Rome had been tortured, blinded, pierced with spikes, and finally boiled alive seemed too horrific, too dishonorable for even Carthage. But as more voices confirmed the details, the Senate fell into a stunned silence. Undone. Senators who had fought alongside Regulus stared at the floor, unable to comprehend the cruelty. Mothers wept openly in the streets. Veterans clenched their fists, vowing that Carthage would pay in blood. It was Regulus's wife, Marcia, who embodied the personal rage of Rome. Accounts claim that when she learned of her husband's death, she tore her garments and fell to the ground in grief. Yet her sorrow quickly hardened into fury. In a cruel twist of fate, two high-ranking Carthaginian prisoners were being held in Rome at the time, captives of noble birth, valuable for future negotiations. But Marcia demanded they be handed over to her, not as hostages but as vessels of vengeance. The Senate, gripped by the horror of Regulus's death, agreed. What followed was Rome's mirror image of cruelty. Marcia, it is said, ordered the Carthaginian captives tortured in ways meant to echo her husband's ordeal. Their eyelids were cut away so they could not shut out the light. They were beaten, pierced, and starved of sleep. Finally, they too were executed in agony, their deaths a personal revenge that Rome silently condoned. In England, traitors were hanged, drawn, and quartered before jeering crowds. In China, generals were executed through lingchi death by 1,000 cuts, each slice a lesson to the living. In each case, the body was turned into a symbol, the suffering magnified to terrify or inspire. Regulus's ordeal belongs to this lineage of spectacle, where death was theater and theater was power. What makes his case unique, however, is that it was not only his enemies who used his pain. His own people turned his suffering into legend. Rome needed martyrs, and Regulus provided the perfect one, honorable, unbroken, and destroyed by cruelty. In this way, he became both victim and weapon. His story used to strike at Carthage long after his body was gone. Today, scholars still debate whether Regulus was a hero or a fool. Some argue that his unyielding adherence to honor condemned him to needless torment and left his family to grieve. Others say that without men like him, who put principle above life, Rome would never have risen to dominate the Mediterranean. The truth lies somewhere between those extremes, a reminder that heroism is often inseparable from tragedy. And what of us, the modern audience? Why does this story still fascinate, horrify, and captivate us? Perhaps because it confronts us with questions we rarely dare to ask. If you were Marcus Atilius Regulus, standing before the Senate with your wife and children begging you to stay, would you have kept your oath? Oh, would you have chosen survival, even if it meant dishonor? Which is the greater sacrifice, the life of one man, or the principle that defines him? These questions are not confined to ancient Rome. Every age wrestles with them, from soldiers on the battlefield to ordinary people asked to choose between safety and integrity. Regulus's fate forces us to look inward and wonder, how much would we endure for what we believe in? How much would we endure? And so the legend of Marcus Atilius Regulus endures not simply because it is gruesome, but because it is human. It reminds us of the thin line between honor and obsession, between justice and vengeance, between truth and propaganda. It is a story that leaves us unsettled because it asks more than it answers. Perhaps that is why it lingers, why even now you are still listening, still picturing the oil boiling, still imagining the screams. Because deep down, you are asking yourself the same question the Romans asked 2,000 years ago. Would I have had the courage to do what he did, or would I have chosen life instead of legend? If this story gripped you, if it shocked you, if it left you thinking about the fragile line between history and myth, then remember, there are countless more tales buried in the past. Stories of men and women whose fates were just as chilling, just as unforgettable. And in our next chapter of dark history, we will unearth another execution so grotesque that it rivals even Regulus's boiling oil. Trust me, you do not want to miss it.